At the beginning of the 20th century, there was no American trucking industry. Roads were rough, engines were unreliable, and long-distance freight still moved by rail or horse. But inside a small Ohio company called White Motor, a different future was already taking shape. They believed that internal combustion would replace animal power, that trucks would reshape commerce, and that whoever controlled that technology would control the movement of the nation. For decades, they were right. The White Motor Company began not as a truck builder, but as a manufacturer of sewing machines. Like many industrial firms of the era, they possessed something far more valuable than any single product: precision manufacturing. That skill allowed them to move into steam automobiles and then into gasoline engines, long before most competitors even understood what those machines could become. When White committed to trucks, they did so with the confidence of a company that already knew how to build durable machinery. By the time the First World War arrived, White trucks were everywhere. The United States military relied on them for transport, logistics, and supply. European armies depended on them as well. White had become synonymous with reliability under brutal conditions. When the war ended, that reputation followed the company back into civilian life. Farmers, businesses, and freight carriers wanted the same machines that had survived the trenches of Europe. Through the 1920s and 1930s, White became one of the dominant forces in American trucking. Their vehicles were not cheap, but they were built to last. Their engines were conservative, their frames were heavy, and their drivetrains were designed for endurance rather than speed. In an era when breakdowns were common, White trucks kept running. That reliability allowed the company to command premium prices and build a loyal customer base. During the Second World War, history repeated itself. White once again became a key military supplier, producing trucks that operated in deserts, jungles, and frozen battlefields. The company emerged from the war stronger than ever. America was about to enter a golden age of highway construction, and White was perfectly positioned to profit from it. In the years that followed, trucking exploded. The interstate system transformed how goods moved. Factories, retailers, and farms became dependent on long-haul transportation. White's competitors included names that would later become legends, but White held a unique advantage. It was not just a truck builder, it was a manufacturing empire. By the 1950s, White controlled a vast industrial network. They produced engines, transmissions, axles, and entire truck platforms. They owned plants across the country. They supplied parts to competitors. They had contracts with the government and major commercial fleets. On paper, they were unstoppable, but inside the company, something was already going wrong. White's leadership believed size was the same thing as strength. Instead of focusing on improving trucks, they began acquiring other companies. They bought truck builders. They bought component manufacturers. They bought unrelated industrial firms. Each acquisition was justified as a way to grow market share and reduce risk. In reality, it was the beginning of a dangerous transformation. White stopped thinking like a truck company and started thinking like a conglomerate. The management culture changed. Engineers lost influence. Accountants gained it. Decisions were no longer driven by product quality or long-term reliability. They were driven by quarterly numbers, balance sheets, and acquisition targets. White was making more money than ever, but it was becoming less focused on what had made it successful in the first place. At the same time, the trucking industry itself was evolving. Competitors like Cummins, Caterpillar, and later Detroit Diesel were pouring resources into engine development. Aerodynamics improved. Fuel efficiency mattered more. Drivers demanded comfort. Fleets wanted lower operating costs. Trucking was becoming a science as much as an industry. White did not respond with the urgency it needed. Their trucks remained durable, but they were increasingly outdated. Cab designs lagged behind competitors. Engine options were limited. Innovation slowed. The company's resources were being spread across dozens of businesses that had nothing to do with building better trucks. Then came the 1970s. Fuel prices surged. Environmental regulations tightened. Customers suddenly cared about efficiency as much as reliability. Smaller fleets struggled. Larger fleets became ruthless about costs. The market was no longer forgiving. Companies that could not adapt quickly would not survive. White was not prepared. The company had invested heavily in acquisitions, not in engineering. They had taken on debt to buy more companies instead of modernizing their products. When sales began to slow, that debt became a crushing burden. Profits vanished. Cash flow tightened. The empire that had looked so powerful on paper began to collapse under its own weight. Desperate to survive, White made a fatal decision. They began cutting costs in the worst possible places. Research and development was slashed. Quality control weakened. Long-term projects were cancelled. The trucks that rolled out of White factories in the mid-1970s were cheaper to build, but they were no longer the best on the road. Customers noticed. Fleets that had once been loyal began to switch brands. Drivers complained. Dealers lost confidence. The reputation that White had built over half a century began to erode in just a few years. By the time White's leadership realized what was happening, it was too late. The debt was too high. The product line was too outdated. The market had moved on. The company that had once defined American trucking was now fighting for survival, and it was losing. By the late 1970s, White Motor Company was no longer an empire built on trucks. It was a financial structure built on debt. Years of acquisitions had created a corporation that looked massive from the outside, but was hollow at its core. White no longer controlled its destiny through engineering or product quality. It was controlled by interest payments, shrinking margins, and an accounting system designed to keep the illusion of stability alive. Inside White's factories, the effects were immediate. Development budgets were frozen. Engineers who had once been encouraged to refine engines, frames, and cab designs were now told to reuse old platforms. Parts suppliers were squeezed. Quality inspectors were reduced. Shortcuts became normal. Trucks that once symbolized reliability began leaving the line with inconsistent build quality. Wiring problems, fit issues, and drivetrain complaints became more common, and for fleets, that meant downtime. Dealers began to feel the strain first. Warranty claims increased. Parts shipments slowed. Customers started asking why their new trucks did not feel like the White trucks they remembered. The company's sales force struggled to explain what was happening, because even internally, no one wanted to admit how bad things had become. Competitors saw the weakness immediately. Cummins was offering engines that delivered better fuel economy. Detroit Diesel was still dominating with its two-stroke designs. Caterpillar was pushing into the on-highway market. Mack and Freightliner were modernizing cab designs and improving driver comfort. White, once an innovator, was now reacting instead of leading. The 1973 fuel crisis made everything worse. Fleets suddenly cared deeply about miles per gallon. White's heavier, less aerodynamic trucks became expensive to operate. Customers who once accepted higher fuel consumption in exchange for durability now demanded both. White could offer neither at a competitive level. Internally, the company tried to fix its finances through more corporate restructuring. Entire divisions were sold. Others were merged. Management focused almost exclusively on balance sheets instead of products. Every decision was made to keep creditors satisfied for one more quarter, not to build a truck that would still be competitive 5 years later. The company's workforce could see what was happening. Morale collapsed. Skilled labor left. The pride that had once defined White factories faded. A company that had built trucks for war and commerce now struggled just to keep the lights on. By 1979, White was in crisis. Cash flow was insufficient to cover debt. Suppliers demanded payment up front. Banks tightened credit. The company no longer had the freedom to invest in new models or technology. It was trapped inside the financial structure it had created. In 1980, the collapse became official. White Motor Company filed for bankruptcy, one of the largest industrial bankruptcies in American history at the time. The empire that had once dominated American trucking was reduced to a legal process and a collection of assets. What followed was not a clean ending. Plants were closed. Workers were laid off. Communities built around White factories were devastated. Some of White's truck designs and facilities were sold and restructured into what would become new companies, but the identity of White was gone. What makes White's story different from so many failed manufacturers is that it was never beaten by a superior product. It was beaten by its own decisions. It chose expansion over excellence. It chose financial engineering over mechanical engineering. It chose growth for the sake of growth instead of protecting the product that made it powerful. White Motor Company did not lose because trucks became irrelevant. It lost because it stopped being a truck company. The machines that once carried the White name were built to last. The corporation behind them was not.